So, without much further ado, I'd like to welcome the next moderator for our panel. His name is Peter Hampson. He's going to be moderating this panel titled African Trade Finance Sustainable by Definition, and he'll also be introducing his panelists. He's the head of marketing and communications at BACB. Peter, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. Hopefully this is on and you can all hear me loud and clear. So good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the final session of the first day of GTR Africa. Now, over the next 3/4 of an hour, we're going to look at the characteristics of the continent's trade finance sector that position it as an oven-ready infrastructure for the delivery of sustainability incentives and the monitoring of ESG practices throughout African supply chains. Our panel are also going to assess the risks related to overemphasis on environmental impact among foreign trade financiers, the knock-on effects this could hold on the African trade finance gap, and ultimately the potential impact on the lives and livelihoods supported by Africa's SMEs. I'm delighted to be joined here in Cape Town by George Wilson, the head of institutional trade finance at Investec. George has worked closely with global and African financial institutions, corporates, merchant traders and DFIs, and been deeply involved in negotiating and brokering trade finance deals throughout Africa and beyond. Alongside George, David Banson, an investment executive within the trade and supply chain finance team at CDC Group, where he manages a portfolio of trade programs and lending to FIs and corporates in Africa and South Asia. Now, ever the modern panel, we're joined virtually by two of our panelists. From the UK, we've got Kibii Sisulu, the manager of sustainable corporate solutions at Sustainalytics. Kibii's role includes supporting global issuers and underwriters in the execution of sustainable finance instruments, helping to bring these instruments to market in alignment with best market practice. And from Switzerland, we're joined by Johanna Wissing, a director at Credit Suisse and the ITFA board member responsible for ESG. Jo is an expert in trade finance origination, syndication, and distribution across numerous geographies and sectors. And she also brings to today's discussion her expertise in deal structuring and a strong knowledge of the fintech sector. Now, it's been stated that the overwhelming focus on climate change mirrors a bias towards environmental issues that often underpin the increased focus on corporate ESG practices, as well as COP-driven commitments to phase fossil fuels out of global financing portfolios. This belies a hard economic truth for Africa's economies and trade, with many African nations still relying on gas and coal power so the strangulation of investment in these sectors poses existential repercussions to sections of Africa's population. I was fascinated by this morning's discussion where Carl Chiwa spoke about ESG and how for Africa this should be GSE. So the first question to our panelists, is there a tendency to overlook the S&G side of things, placing too much emphasis on the E in the African context? And if so, why is that? Is it that environmental issues are more tangible or measurable when compared with S&G and therefore easier to focus on? George, if I could come to you first on this question.
So the short answer is yes. There is an overemphasis on the E piece, and I really liked Carl's reordering to GSE for Africa in particular. And I would go a little bit further. I would say that we should be talking about sustainable trade finance rather than fixating on ESG. And I'll go into that a little bit later. But the main reasons behind that is largely because the debate and standardization efforts have been largely dominated by global players who sit in Western cities. And while particularly the environmental side is clearly the most relevant and apposite thing to focus on for if you're sitting in Frankfurt or Washington or London, there's been a misapprehension of two important factors within the African trade finance market when it relates to ESG sustainability. The first is the market itself and the social context of the African market, and the second is the product. And you know, those two aspects have really come together to make things difficult from a prioritization perspective, particularly in four ways. I guess the first is you know, E, the environment, is clearly the most appropriate thing for people sitting in a Western context from a Western perspective. And it's just not personally relevant, and I think you said tangible for them, you know, from their seat. The second is the idea of a just transition. It seems to have been largely overlooked, and the reality is that only 2% of global emissions come from Africa. So you know, while there's a clear emphasis and rightful emphasis on you know, Western governments and a Western view to reduce emissions, they contribute the overwhelming you know, amount of carbon emissions. I guess the third piece is really where this product comes in, where a lot of those players, the consultants and lawyers sitting in their global seat, who are experts on ESG when it comes to debt, really want to repurpose a lot of the ESG technology that they can use for debt, and they've kind of misapprehended the mechanics of trade finance, and that technology just simply doesn't work for trade when it comes to certifying the green credentials of trade, or the sustainable credentials of trade. And then I guess the last piece is the governance. So the bit that Carl put first is very important. There is a need to make sure that that greenwashing isn't happening, and that governance is actually, unbeknownst to a lot of those largely debt financiers, that governance is embedded within trade finance naturally, because you have those independent banks who are actually African banks who are actually financing the trade to the African merchants, and they introduce that independent governance. They're all regulated, they're all licensed, and you know, Africans can do governance too. And then I guess to sum it all up, you know, as the title suggests, you know, we certainly argue that African trade finance is sustainable by definition.
I think that's a great point. And I'd like to bring Joe in from Credit Suisse at this point, if I may. Joe, same questions to you, really. Are we focusing far too much on the environmental aspects, and what more can we do to focus on the S&G side of things?
Hello, very nice to be here. I hope you can hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Okay, well, thank you for having me and having me virtually. I would have loved to be in Cape Town with you guys, but sadly timing didn't work out this year. Yeah, I totally agree with the feeling that DE has been the main focus here, and the S and the G have certainly, well, I wouldn't say neglected, but have certainly not taken the same sort of like front and center of the debate. Several reasons for that, many of which George has already mentioned. I guess yeah, on the one hand, we have certainly politics and policies being made in Western capitals, but of course the developing world is not in Western capitals. And then on the other hand, I think it was also in the past very easy, or easier, so to say, to measure the environmental impacts rather than focusing on the S and the G. Whereas, of course, and this is something that's particularly from a trade finance perspective, in particular, if I look at sort of like the short-term vanilla commodity business that, of course, moves a lot of the world, where, of course, some of these policies that might have been introduced in the past would actually backfire from an S&G perspective. I'm particularly thinking about exiting coal-related transactions, etc. And of course, yeah, we all want to move to cleaner and better sources of energy. But at the same time, if we look at the developing world and its high dependency on, for example, such sources of energy, I think we've sacrificed a lot of the S for the sake of the E, and we need to find a better balance to avoid sort of like, yeah, sacrificing too much of the S in future. So that's certainly something that as a trade finance community, I think, again, it is very important to find ways to measure and to find sort of like that balance as well between the E, the S, and the G. And I really like the GSE. That sounds good.
Thank you very much indeed, Joe. And turning to David now, George mentioned in his closing piece, and it is, of course, the title of this, African Trade Finance, the ultimate conduit for the delivering of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, that African trade finance is sustainable by definition. So should we be focusing a lot more on that? Are we focusing too much on the environmental impacts at the moment?
Yeah, thanks, and it's really lovely to be in Cape Town as well. We did this last year virtually, and it's much nicer to be in person to see everybody.
Second that.
Sorry, Joe.
It's tough to be in the seat from a DFI perspective on this particular subject, and I think that's probably why George wanted me here to give me the business. But I think from a DFI perspective, ESG is part of our investment DNA, right? ESG is not a tick box exercise for us. It's something that we've always done across our investment suite. And particularly when it comes to trade finance, I actually, would say that this idea that, trade finance in Africa is intrinsically developmental is not new from a DFI perspective. We've always viewed it that way. At CDC, we've built $1 billion portfolio in trade finance in 3 or so years. And our thesis, our impact thesis for that over the past few years has been exactly that every dollar into trade finance is a dollar into the trade finance gap. And every inch of that gap that we've closed with financing has had direct consequences on livelihoods of people, on supporting businesses, on employment, and so on and so forth. So that concept is something that we've totally backed, and I think I want to be clear. But at the same time, again, talking about CDC, we invest in 5-year strategy cycles, and over the last 5 years, we invested £7 billion in our markets, mobilized another £2.5 billion. In the next 5 years, we expect to build on that and invest close to £2 million every year into our markets. And one key part of what we're going to do is, you guessed it, the E's. We're going to focus on green infrastructure and so on and so forth. So I do agree with the concept of it. But what I do want to point out, and I think this is where it probably gets interesting for us, is whether this focus on the E is a shift or an expansion, right? Is it a shift of investment capital away from anything that is not E? Or is it an expansion to include the E? And is it an expansion in investment appetite, including E's and across the spectrum? And from a DFI perspective and from a CDC perspective, I would like to say that it is an expansion. And there is a lot of new opportunities that we can think about that are available for us to tap into. And I do think that at the end of the day, what we want to see is dollars into the trade finance gap, E or no E.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm. Yeah. So look, I'm not, obviously the CDC is one of the good guys, and they are actually making a difference. But it does seem incredibly frustrating from a seat in Africa where there are billions of dollars of ESG investors, sustainable funding available, and still a growing $100 billion plus trade gap in Africa. And $7 billion is an excellent start, and like I say, I think the CDC is contributing towards that. But what we kind of need, I think, is more education and a voice in those largely Western cities, which I think the CDC has, around communicating this idea that all African trade finance is necessarily developmental and fulfilling those UN SDG goals. And certainly, I think Joe maybe will talk about it a little bit later. There have been some excellent ICC papers on sustainable trade finance. The problem is that they had a very first world focus, and we need a greater African voice to make it relevant for the emerging markets.
So working on that educational piece and getting that data together, I'd like to come over to Kibii in London and talk about some of the things that you're doing to measure that. So Kibii, to bring you in on this point particularly, how do we begin to measure the S&G side of things?
Yeah, thank you for that. So if I could, talk very quickly about the, how things we would assess on an ESG perspective, and just looking into, some of the key components of ESG strategies. And so, there are many answers to this question, but the three kind of things that we look at within a robust sustainability strategy are, number one, a recognition of material ESG risks associated to a company's sector and business model, and making sure that there's a clear understanding and relevance to these challenges in line with, the day-to-day business activities of that company. And secondly, how else we would measure ESG? We'd look at how the corporate or entity intends to address these issues. So in essence, what policies and practices and procedures do they have in place to mitigate against some of these risks and challenges? And then lastly, most importantly, we look at, how the corporate measures and tracks and reports against the impact as a result of their ESG commitments. So, things having like, clear KPIs and ambitious targets, having sustainability objectives that are aligned to the Sustainable Development Goals. These are all key things that we will look at and measure to understand, the sustainability profile of a company.
Thank you, Kibii. So there are 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals. And in his recent article in GTR, George pointed out that only 4 of these relate to climate change. The others include ending poverty and hunger, ensuring quality education, providing inclusive and sustainable employment for all, building resistant infrastructure, and reducing inequalities between countries. Now, with funders becoming risk-averse throughout the pandemic, as has been pointed out already, Africa's pre-existing $82 billion trade finance gap widened further. And this became particularly acute for the 80% of private businesses in the region, which are SMEs. As access to funding becomes even harder and funders exit the market, remedying the impact of the pandemic is proving to be quite a cumbersome task. But one thing is very true. Concerted action and increased investment will enable Africa to advance towards meeting those 17 SDGs in line with the rest of the world. But my question to the panelists, how can the West better support the implementation of these goals and address that trade finance gap? David, if I could come to you first on that.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Peter. Maybe I'll steal a few seconds to say before I get into it that, I'm sure most people already know, CDC Group, the UK's development finance institution, is changing its name. So we're going to be British International Investment, BI. And if you're thinking that we changed our name because we no longer want to be confused with the Center for Disease Control,
You're right.
You're absolutely right. But it's more importantly to connect us more in name with our shareholders and with the broader UK development aid and financing machinery. So that was the message from my headquarters. Wanted to get that out of the way. But I do think, Peter, that we are at a very critical juncture in terms of financing Africa trade. Mostly because just a few years ago, pre-COVID, we were seeing improvements in the closing of the trade financing gap. And I think that's something that all of us probably in this room have had some contribution towards, and we should all be very proud of that. And especially with what's happening with Ukraine and Russia, we are at a critical junction where if we don't take immediate steps to revamp the financing into trade finance in Africa will probably slip back way too far. And when I think about that, three things mainly come to mind, and that's partnerships, facilitation, and a little bit of faith, right? And I start with partnerships because, every time I get the chance, I said before that CDC has built a trade finance portfolio of over $1 billion in the last 3 years, and that would simply not be possible without the partners that we have, pulled together to making that possible. Obviously, our product trade finance is very intermediated, and so there's, you simply cannot do it without the right partners in the right place. And I think that's really important. And I know the question is about how we get Western capital into the trade finance gap, but I think, it is important for us as African financiers to stay ready in terms of being partnership ready for the capital that's available in the West to come through to us. And I think that's a very important point for us to also continue to bear in mind. In terms of facilitation, I think this is the point that you made, George. There's a lot of influence on the West, which can be tapped into making certain things happen in our markets. I still can't believe that supply chain finance is such a small part of the total trade and supply chain financing in our markets. It's just incredible and still unbelievable. I've said once that it is very likely that almost 50% of Africa's GDP is carried every day in invoices, purchase orders, and so on and so forth. And I think that might be true, and there's huge potential there. And the challenge there is that there is some type of facilitation that is required by people who have the capacity to do it. And I heard this morning from AfriExim that there's that type of engagement that's going on in terms of the legal perspective and so on, and that's all great. And so I think that facilitation will go a very long way, and players like the CDC, the IFC, the EBRDs of the world need to get in there and try and help us to move certain aspects of our financing gap forward. It's the only way we can bridge the gap. And the last thing I talk about, a little bit of faith, is that COVID has taught us lessons that we already knew, that every time there's a little bit of a shakeup in the world, the first instinct of international financiers is to just leave. And I think that approach is getting old, and I think we all need to say it to their faces that it's getting a bit old. It needs to change because we cannot keep treating the African market as some type of opportunistic market where we only come in when things are good. We have to make the investments into the market and stay throughout the process or whatever crisis that we're going through. So I think I'll leave it there, Peter.
I think that's a great point. It's a long-term commitment. Joe, I'd be interested to hear your perspective from Credit Suisse on the bridging of the trade finance gap and what more we can do and what more financial institutions like Credit Suisse can do.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, we always speak about the trade finance gap, of course, and the trade finance gap widening. We've seen it particularly during the pandemic. I'd say, of course, one of the challenges that's always been quoted in that context is certainly the availability of KYC and the availability of credit. So it's great what David's mentioning in terms of working with the likes of AfriExim, with the IFC, with the EBRD, and all of course in the Asian context with the Asian Development Bank, which certainly helps a great deal on that angle because, well, you all know the capital costs of banks, unfortunately, for trade finance seem to be only going one way, which is rising. And again, we have that sort of like that KYC angle, of course. On the other hand, I think there is reason for optimism here, in that I think we've seen in the sort of like immediate post-financial crisis years that banks were cutting back on their global relationships and their correspondent banking relationships, whereas I feel now that actually banks are widening and increasing these networks again, which in turn should hopefully help for the provision of credit, in particular in sort of like the developing world. So definitely that angle is a very important aspect, and I think in that context, when we're talking about KYC, I think we will see ever greater emphasis, and I see it certainly in my institution, but I would also say I hear it a lot from other market participants I work with in the context of the ITFA, that we see an increasing focus certainly on the sustainability aspects of clients and increasing focus to really sort of like incorporate that already at the onboarding and sort of KYC stage to look into where sort of like the green amber red sort of like are in terms of clients and industries and everything. And I think that will hopefully, as we move towards greater standardization, having more definitions, that will certainly form an important part of the onboarding process, and hopefully that will therefore also help to encourage developments in the right way in that context.
Thank you, Joe. George, moving to you.
Look, I mean, I think this is another area where the product understanding is important, and I know that the panelists all understand that trade product is different from debt. I'm just worried that maybe some of their shareholders aren't aware of those differences. And while it's intuitively obvious that a green bond is contributing towards some environmental cause, just through scientific measurement and KPIs, and Sustainalytics can measure that and certify it. If you're talking about some of the other SDGs, like providing inclusive and sustainable employment for all, it's not clear how an individual trade transaction can be measured from that perspective. What KPIs would you apply to it? Either that or reducing inequalities between countries. Now, just because it's harder doesn't to frame in that kind of certification framework doesn't mean that we shouldn't be addressing those social and development goals. And this is where trade finance will set you free, because trade finance necessarily delivers to in fragile economies at least a third of GDP growth in developing economies. If you're actually reaching the SME trade finance market, they employ 85% of the population, of the working population. Now you're automatically, through assisting in African trade finance, delivering to those SDGs without having to have some neat line to certification. And there needs to be, I think, broader understanding of trade product in order to grasp that.
I think that's a great point. Kibii, I'd like to bring you into the conversation here, particularly on the last point of tangible measurement that George mentioned. That measurement of an organisation's activities, the impact on ESG commitments in Africa, can be hugely beneficial when justifying the financing of trade transactions, particularly to the continent, both to committees within organisations, but also externally to the public, to shareholders of those institutions as well. What do you look for in that company's ESG rating, and how do Sustainalytics look at actually pulling that together and producing that risk rating?
Yeah, sure. So when we're looking at ESG risk ratings, right, our methodology is formed of three key components. So the first thing that we would want to look at is the corporate sub-industry and understand their overall ESG exposure. So by exposure, we want to look at the key and relevant ESG-related factors that pose potential ESG risks for companies in that sub-industry. So we're looking at things like product governance, occupational health and safety, business ethics, etc., etc. The second thing that we would, focus our attention towards is, the management risk. How does the company manage against some of those ESG challenges and issues? What commitments, policies, and procedures does a company have in place to manage against that exposure? And then the last component of our methodology is where we would look at the unmanaged risk of the company, which includes, the unmanageable risk. Typically, you find some companies and sectors, you're not able to navigate away from those challenges and issues. But then there is also a management gap, which represents the risks that could potentially be managed by the company, but aren't sufficiently managed according to our assessment. So at the end of that process and at the end of that assessment, we would form an ESG risk rating and score. And coming back to your question, why is this so relevant to sustainable trade in Africa? I think there's innovative ways for banking institutions and lenders to include ESG risk ratings as well as KPIs within loan and trade documentation, so that that trade facility and that trade loan can be sustainable, right? And the company has to manage their ESG profile to gain benefit in that trade facility. Now, I think George makes a very good point. I think there needs to be some more education by the Western world around how trade works. Typically, one of the challenges that is had around sustainable trade is, how do you tie that trade facility to impact? How do you track against that, given that the nature of these instruments are quite short term? So that's one of the things that I think we need to do, is just that education piece around incorporating ESG factors into sustainable trade. I
think that education piece is a fantastic point. To the wider group, I'd like to ask, how can this information, such as Sustainalytics work, help your firms when making these investment decisions? And have you seen other technological solutions which can help sustainable trade growth? Joe, I saw you nodding along quite a bit with what Kibii was saying there. Do you mind if I come to you first?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. No, it's definitely a topic that's very close to my heart, because I always think that with technology, we can certainly make our businesses more robust, and therefore, of course, excuse the pun, more sustainable. So absolutely, I think technology can play a huge role here. So let me come to that secondly, though. Just briefly on what you said about education, Peter. That certainly is a very, very important aspect in the context of ESG as well, and on many different levels, starting with basically educating us as trade financiers actually on what does ESG really mean in the trade context, because as George has already pointed out, hopefully we all have the relevant knowledge of how trade finance works, but what does it really mean in a trade finance context, which is something that we want to, as ITFA, we want to address certainly, because we just feel there's so much resource out there, but it needs to be brought to life more in the trade context. And then, of course, there is the educational piece in terms of how can we work with our clients, our corporates that we work with and deal with on a daily basis. How can we help businesses to become more sustainable? And of course, that's really important, because that's a huge opportunity, right? It's actually it's actually sort of like the opportunity to go into the 21st century, of course. Now, speaking of 21st century, speaking of technology, therefore, I think technology can play a huge role here in terms of measuring, for example, against the UN SDG, and we see some examples, for example, in the UK, with the likes of Cosmos and Coriolis, who have started to create, sort of like ESG passports that a corporate sort of like can obtain and have a rating, which in turn can massively help to tackle greenwashing. Because if I think about one risk in the whole ESG discussion that's huge in my eyes, it is the danger of greenwashing. And I think that technology can play a huge role here in terms of measuring and assigning scores, and therefore helping to address that risk, amongst other things. And of course, that in turn also again helps with what Kibii was mentioning earlier, ESG KPIs being part of banks' financing structures. And we've certainly seen this more and more, and for example, Sustainalytics are one of the providers, of course, that are being used to measure against KPIs, and in turn that gives clients a good opportunity to measure sort of like their efforts in the space. At the same time, it allows financiers to have a reliable source to then offer better margins, respectively offer margin budgets. So yeah, definitely technology is huge in this context.
Thank you, Joe. Before we move on to the educational and the governance piece, I'd just like George, if you'd like to just let us know what aspects of technology have you seen that have benefited in the investment decisions that you're taking?
Yeah, so look, if you go the route of enforcing evidence of the green or sustainable credentials of an individual trade finance asset, then it's an information problem. You need to list out, where the goods are coming from, who the buyer is, who the seller is, how it's transmitted, all of those details, which makes perfect sense it's an information problem, and the answer is almost certainly digital. But really, in the context of the Western world, the reality of SME trade finance in Africa is it's all administrated through paper. And it's tier 3 banks and some non-bank financiers who are actually providing those trade finance and working capital facilities to SMEs in Africa, and they're taking their shack as collateral, right? They are where the cash is needed and where the financing is needed. And what we're looking to do is transfer those pools of ESG investors' dollars, largely, into Africa in order to finance those facilities. So the Sustainalytics point, I absolutely accept Joe's point on the digital solutions in order to capture and marshal that information to prove the credentials and have access to the cash is great and the right solution, but in a Western context. Getting that cash down to fill in the trade gap it will, I'm sure, in years to come, it will be digital in Africa. Right now, it's not appropriate. And the real point is, we don't need it. We know that trade finance is sustainable. We know that it delivers to all the SDGs in any event. Why do we need to reprove it in order to access that information and make it dependent on digital solutions that aren't really going to be viable in Africa where they're needed for the next decade?
Thank you, George. Moving on to the governance space. So another key global priority on the agenda is the need to address the illicit financial flows, the understanding of regulatory changes that are taking place, and ensuring that correct processes and procedures are in place within firms so that the transactions being undertaken are safe and sustainable. I'd like to ask the panel, with the perceived risks that specialist markets represent, in your view, what are the key compliance challenges and issues you face today when working with these specialist markets? Joe, if I could come to you first at Credit Suisse for your perspective.
Wow, that's a huge question. Quite topical as well, of course. Looking at the market slightly more east from Zurich. That obviously is the most important, actually, these days, the most important aspects of sort of like doing any deal, you could almost say, because if you don't have your governance in order, then of course the repercussions are on all sorts of ends, right? So that is key, and again, I think that's where technology is actually the key aspect. And I completely hear what you were saying, George, in terms of obviously trade being very paper-based, and we should learn to walk before we want to run. So I'm completely with you on that, but I would generally say on the governance aspect, it's of course it's of the highest, the utmost importance now, and again, what has come on top of sort of like the known topics in the KYC, AML, and sanction space is certainly also the ESG consideration, and to make sure that from a sustainability perspective, business makes sense, and that certainly for us is now part of our overall trade sign-off process. And again, I'd say there's certainly a role that technology can play in terms of helping that process and speeding it up. But it's an absolute business imperative. It's not a nice to have. Good governance.
Thank you, Joe. David, if I could just bring you in first of all on this. What are the key challenges that you see, particularly from a governance perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Obviously, it's a big challenge for trade finance. I think there are reports that say that close to maybe 200,000 correspondent banking relationships have left the emerging market space since the last, global financial crisis, and that's amazing. It makes you wonder who's left. I think that from that perspective, even DFIs have a challenge there. From CDC perspective, for instance, we are FCA regulated, and so we also need to think about these things ourselves. But I think what's interesting for me is, the kind of linkages that you can draw, right? When the West, so-called West, decides to fix a problem, which we don't necessarily disagree with, we need to, prevent we need to, support counterterrorism and prevent money laundering and so on. Just like we need to defend our planet and protect our planet. But every time the West comes up with that, it tends to be that Africa is at the tail end of, the solutions that are supposed to come in to solve some of these problems. And I think, the West needs to change its approach to some of these things. Africa has changed. Regulation has improved leaps and bounds. Capacities of the bankers themselves have increased, the markets have deepened, and so on and so forth. And I think it's, where I will leave it is that it's important that view, from the West continues to change into a more positive view when talking about, things that affect our continent. And again, I'll repeat what I said before, this idea that of treating Africa as, some type of opportunistic investment and immediately leaving when something changes is a bit of a shame, and that completely needs to change.
Thank you, David. George, when we were talking earlier, we were speaking about the inherent governance that's in place within trade finance transactions and how we have a trusted intermediary in pretty much every trade transaction that we're dealing with, where we've got independent people examining the trade documents. Governance is built into African trade finance.
Yeah, and that's really the message that we'd like to convey. I guess, again, people, and particularly, the ESG community is looking at trade finance through debt and maybe project finance eyes, where you've got an investor lender sitting in New York or London, and you've got usually a government or parastatal, borrower sitting in Africa, and there, you need an independent intermediary. We can look at all of the, terrorist financing implications as well as ESG. But in trade finance, you've necessarily got these financiers in the middle. They happen to be African, but they're still regulated. They're still regulated by all the same global regulations. They're licensed, and they're staffed by career professionals. And they're dealing with very, relatively very small assets. We're not talking about, a even $10 million asset tempting, people into malfeasance. We're talking about, very many, very small trade assets that are where all of the parties are known intimately by those individuals in those African banks. And all of that governance comes for free with trade finance. It's just not clear that that's transparent to the outside world.
I think that's a great point to make. And as a specialist bank, we certainly have complete oversight over every step of the trade transaction. We've onboarded the banks that are issuing the LCs. We're confirming them. We're screening all of the names on the LCs as they come through us.
Every single related party name?
Every single related party. We get all the documents through. We check the vessels. We check the ports. We check everything on those. We even go to the IMB to see where the vessel's been. There is that natural oversight over everything that we do. And I know certainly other partners as well and other banks have been doing outreach programs to help bring other banks up to the equivalent regulatory standards, and that is happening. We're seeing a real desire across the continent to operate at the highest regulatory standard.
And that echoes, Carl's point about GSE,
yeah,
and the governance kind of coming first, particularly for trade finance.
We are, I notice, running close on time now. This has been a fascinating panel. I just wanted to see if there's any questions from the audience that have come through. Have we got any questions in the audience? Anybody would like to talk about this? I'm also going to check my phone. We've got a question over there. And I've got a couple of questions that have come in over the WhatsApp.
Good afternoon, Andreas Rusch. Johanna, you mentioned you want to use technology to detect and prevent greenwashing. Now, we're here in finance, commodity finance. We've always written money off, a significant amount of money off, because of double discounting, triple discounting, because of fraudulent bills of lading, because of fraudulent warehouse receipts. Maybe we should start and detect fraudulent warehouse receipts and detect fraudulent bills of lading rather than fraudulent greenwashing. Maybe we can prevent write-off of money, and then we can focus on the, I would want to call it the soft CPs, not so much the hard CPs. Let's first get the hard CPs right, not write-off money, and then we can focus on the ESG. And then we can also decide GSE or SGE or whatever sequence we want. Maybe we should not write off money, make the money available, and then focus on the others.
So we should be closing that trade finance gap first.
Well, look, I mean, that's obviously my position. And, you know, it is very frustrating that there is all this money available. It's just not finding itself to the right place. And yes, there are still gaps in the governance. There are still gaps in the governance globally, as we saw from some of the commodity traders that went under in Dubai and Asia in the last couple of years. But that shouldn't preclude advancement in terms of this type of developmental, sustainable financing to you know, pull the economy, pull the continent along.
Thank you. I'd like to bring others in. Joe and Kibii, if you'd like to come in on this one as well. Closing that trade finance gap, getting the funds on the ground being the priority.
Yeah, and thank you for that comment. I think it was Jan. And thank you, George. I totally agree with you. I think one doesn't preclude the other, so let's focus on both. Certainly, again, I think when it comes to the trade finance gap, what we need to ensure is that we stay on it and solving for it. I know we keep on saying, oh, not enough progress is being made. But I'd say that therefore then to say let's forget about it is obviously not the right option, right? So we just need to absolutely stay on it. And again, I'm more optimistic there than I would have been a few years after the GFC. I really think there is a lot more focus now on investment and on getting money to the ground. So I just hope that can continue that way, and certainly what will be again important in that context is right governance in order to ensure that financiers really want to get into these markets.
Thank you, Joe. Kibii, final words from you?
Yeah, so from my perspective, in terms of getting more money on the ground, I think there needs to be some work done to kind of shift the mindset of the international investor community. That more needs to be done on the social aspect, right? When you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, it's not just about climate change. There's also a number of social aspects there that need extra support. And particularly when you're looking at Africa, there are a number of projects and assets, as well as kind of trade finance that needs to be kind of supported when looking at green and social investments. Typically you'd see in the Western world things like the building of roads, for example, would be classed as a green project. But for Africa, sorry, it would not be classed as a green project because of emissions, but for Africa, this should be viewed more in a social context. So I think there needs to be a lot of work there, just educating investors around the social piece.
think it's a fascinating point.
And
Thank you,
Peter, if
Kibii.
you don't mind, I'll just chip
Please.
in here that, obviously, that's the beauty about technological advancements and so on. It doesn't solve, well, if you do it right, doesn't solve for one and leave the other. So if we fix technology, we'll fix greenwashing, we'll fix double discounting, we will fix the reporting problem, we will fix the, being able to show what we are financing and so on and so forth. And I think if we take anything away, probably, which is what I talk about, the opportunities that may exist within, this focus on the E, if all that the E does for us, the focus on the E does for us is push, the African continent, African trade finance into doing certain things which we haven't yet done for a long time, like digitization, for instance, then it would probably be a win for all of us,
Thank you very much. I realize we're right up on time. I don't want to be responsible for you being delayed to get to the reception. So I'm going to say a massive thank you. It's been a fascinating discussion. Huge thank you to Joe and to Kibii joining us remotely, and a massive thank you to George and David here with us in the room. Thank you to all of you for watching. Thank you.
Thank you.